Hello, good evening. Okay, good evening. Hi, everybody. It's so great to see such a great audience tonight. We're back for our spring semester of the California Colloquium on Water, and this is our first lecture. My name is Linda Vita. I'm the head of the Water Resources Center Archives here on the campus. And a few of my standard announcements. We videotape each lecture so that, and you can watch them, or your friends, you're here, so you don't need to watch the lecture again, but unless you want to. But you can have your friends watch the lecture if they're so sad that they missed it, about a week after. And I have a sign-up sheet in the back. If you would like to be on our reminder list, please, and you are not currently on it, please sign the list and give us your email address. And I guess that's it. And I'd like to introduce Professor Michael Hanneman, who is from our Agricultural Economics Department, and he will introduce our speakers this evening.
I'm delighted. We have two speakers. They'll each speak for about 20 minutes, and we'll hold questions until they've both finished speaking. So I'll start introducing David. David is director of the Center for Irrigation Technology at Fresno State and other related water institutes at Fresno State. He has undergraduate and master's degrees in agribusiness and agricultural economics. And without further ado, we're delighted to welcome you.
Okay. Am I mic'd up here? I guess I'm okay. Well, thank you for inviting me, Linda, and whoever else decided who was going to kick this off. And so we kind of picked this title. Maybe it's a little provocative, but and what I'm going to try to do today is give you a little bit of definitions, a little baseline of what some of the water issues are, maybe a little hint of the complexities of it. It's not quite as simple as maybe some would like to make it out to be. And hopefully you'll walk away with a little better understanding and improve your knowledge base in such a way that as you hear more about these water issues, which are not going to go away, you can maybe put them in a framework that makes them understandable. So with that, or at least more understandable, I don't want to over amp my presentation here. So okay, so anyway, I'm going to do a little introduction. We're going to talk about some definitions. Going to give you a few real-world examples. Going to talk about a few future unknowns that are kind of drive what's going to happen, and then kind of give you a little summary of conclusions as I see it. Okay, so agriculture in California and the world is the largest user of developed water supplies. And so, depending on how you cut that, 65, 75, 80% of California's water goes to growing crops in California. You look in Pakistan, India, it's 65%, 70%. So those numbers are, pretty constant around the irrigated world, if you will, particularly those with Mediterranean climates. California agriculture is really a world leader. 8 of the 10 top counties in the country. I think there's one up in Washington, state of Washington, and one in Colorado that are on that list. But certainly we are very productive with our agriculture and with our water. And what's interesting about California agriculture is, we're in a Mediterranean climate, right? It rains in the winter time and it's pretty dry in the summer. So unlike the Midwest, and if you've ever flown over the Midwest, you see these circles and they're called center pivots. That's supplemental irrigation, okay? They get some rainfall. Their idea of a drought is, 3 weeks without rain. So they have to run around with their sprinklers, get a little water on so that the crop doesn't start to suffer from lack of water. So we are essentially 100% dependent on irrigation in this state for agricultural production. Okay, and we do a pretty good job. Fresno County, and by the way, we go back and forth between Tulare County, and actually the big driver there is the dairy industry of all things. Dairy industry is a big deal. Creates lots of money, and then the value added of cheese and all the yogurts and all the stuff we like downstream of that is a big thing. But add it all up, we're about 25 billion. I think that they call that at the farm gate. That's what produce from the field is. That doesn't count the value added of the grapes that go to make wine and get $100 bottles of wine or whatever it is we were drinking tonight. I'm sure it was at least 100. So that number, you know, they talk about a 2 or 3 to 1 multiplier on that number as far as the economic impact, truckers moving stuff around, all that kind of stuff. So, you know, it does add value, we hope, and I think everybody likes to eat. I know I do, and probably too much. So I want to talk about defining a few terms before I kind of go through my little talk today so that, you know, we're all on the same page. And it's pretty simple definitions. An acre foot of water is 12 inches of water over an acre of land, okay? No, not, I don't think it's quite a football field, is it? Close? Okay, and it's 326,000 gallons. So yeah, I guess if you, does that include the end zones or not? Okay. So if we went out here and we put a foot of water on that, that's what an acre foot of water is. Evapotranspiration, you hear about that, and that's kind of how the plant sweats or what the plant uses, you know, in its growth. And what's evaporated into the air, okay? And those two components are used combined. Sometimes they're kind of hard to break apart. Irrigation efficiency, and you see this term talked about lots of different ways. What I'm going to talk about today is what's used beneficially by the crop and what's been applied to the field, okay? Now the beneficial to the crop can include, if you will, driving salts out of the root zone, because if the salts are in the root zone, the crop's not really benefiting from it, right? So there are a number of other things than just the crop use that go into that. And then basin efficiency is really about a large area of land, and again, the same definition, but it includes all the farms and water districts within a region. A watershed, typically, Tulare hydrologic basin or the San Joaquin would be a basin efficiency that we might want to look at. And I know somebody's going to point out that these numbers are skewed or something, but I just want to give you some reference points in your brains about what an acre foot of water means. An almond orchard can use 4 feet, so be about this high across the whole field, right? In the course of a year to produce a crop of almonds. And whoops, I just went someplace, didn't I? Okay. And interesting enough, ag land gets converted to urban uses. I mean, that happens everywhere. And so what you see is that an acre foot of water can support, and again, these are numbers that are sort of historic, but you know, we're getting higher density now, but a family of 4 for a year, okay? And so then 4 acre feet, if we were converting almond ground to houses, could get us, at least in the land of the valley where we've got relatively cheap property, you could get 4 homes and you could get 16 folks living there for that 4 acre feet. Now, certainly higher density housing, even in Fresno, is starting to happen, and we're trying to do the right thing, and lower per capita use of water. But just in general terms, just kind of think of an acre foot of water supports a family of 4, and that's going to vary by region and other things. But just, again, to give you a reference point. This is really the sleeping gun for us. I mean, this is the thing that's going to bite us really hard, is that we're out of balance by millions of acre feet annually, and we're overdrafting the aquifer. And there's lots and lots of data out there. And just at Fresno State, where I'm at, we've got a little farm, 1,000 acres. It's sort of this laboratory for the students. And I was looking at the records a while back, and in the 50s, the water was at 50 feet. Today, it's 150 feet. So we've lost 100 feet. And if you looked at a reservoir and saw it down 100 feet, you'd probably get all excited. That's a lot of water. But since it's underground, we tend to ignore it. We just don't sort of visualize that we're running out of water. And I suppose that, as Benjamin Franklin said, you know the worth of water when the well goes dry, and I suspect when the well goes dry, we'll get more excited about it. But hopefully we're smarter than that, and we'll make some preemptive changes in our actions. And then for those who did get an email that went out, there was an attachment, right, that you sent out. There's a report NASA from satellite-based data now can look down and look at some bulk density things. I'm going to tell you more, and I know right now how they do that, but they look down into the soil, and they can determine the changes in the aquifers in the San Joaquin Valley and the Central Valley and stuff. And they've determined through their data that the south part of the valley is losing about 2 million acre feet of water annually. And it's a little higher than I think some of the other numbers, but it trends in that direction. We're overdrafting. You can't keep writing checks against your savings account. One day you're going to be broke, and we're heading that way. Okay, so ag water uses. There's different plants that use different amounts of water at different times, at different growth stage. So, a small tree uses less water than a big tree. Row crops use less water in the spring than they do in the summer when they're bigger, that kind of stuff. And irrigation type and method. There's a couple things, misconceptions that get spread out there. I just kind of want to enlighten you to those. My friends that are in the drip business love this notion that plants irrigated with drip use less water, okay? I'm here to tell you that the plants don't really care how they get the water, whether it's drip, flood, sprinkler, doesn't matter. They're going to use the same amount of water, and actually in drip micro, we know that the plants use a little bit more water many, many times. And the reason for that is that the frequency of the irrigation, you irrigate every day. The plant is sitting there in a happy state of water because it sees water every day. Where in a flood system, for instance, or a furrow, you irrigate every 2 or 3 weeks. So for the first few days, there's lots of water. By the time you get down to the 10th or the 14th day, what's happened is the soil's dried out. The ability of the plant to extract water is much more difficult, okay? And so the crop coefficient, the demand that plant is actually lower than you would see in a drip irrigated plant right adjacent to it. So there are some trade-offs, but the upside of that is that typically drip irrigated plants, or not typically, but in a lot of cases, you'll get some higher yield. So it will manifest itself. Even though it's using more water per acre, the plants, it may, the crop per drop kind of thing people like to talk about, maybe you get a little more yield per unit of water. And then you do get, on micro sprayers and stuff, if you get high dry winds and stuff, you can have significant evaporation. I know I did my master's degree, actually. That's how I got in this silly business. I should have never taken that project. But anyway, I was looking at sprinklers and pressures and stuff, and we found like a single sprinkler on a hot day, like 50% of it was being lost, okay? And it's evaporation and wind drift. It just was blowing away. Now, there's other things going on there, but it can be quite high depending on the condition. You get really low humidity and you get high winds and hot temperatures, and a lot of that water won't make it into the soil. Okay, so irrigation efficiency. We talked a little bit about that. And what I want to show you is just the complexity of what we're trying to manage in order to be very efficient with our water. And so first it is the engineered system that delivers water out there, right? Whether it's through a furrow system, a sprinkler system, a drip system, or a micro system, okay? It is engineered, you got pressure losses, you got elevation changes, so it's not going to be 100%. It's going to be something less than 100 just because engineering, at least in economic terms, you can't get there from here, okay? And then soil topography, conditions, salinity, those are all important. And then finally, you've got to decide when and how much water to apply to the plant, right? Because it's going to be changing. So I'm going to give you a little sense of that. What this is, and this actually didn't show up very well. I'm disappointed in that. But what I was really trying to show you here, and if you could see it like it's on my computer, but basically this is the wettest part of the pattern. There we go. And this is the driest part of the pattern, okay? And they're right adjacent to each other. So just remember that this is not, these are sprinklers, 1, 2, and 3, and then there's some sprinklers on the outside that contribute to this. But in reality, this is getting, I don't know, 10% or 15% less water here than perhaps over here, okay? Maybe more. So understand that in what we would call a reasonably good uniformity from sprinklers, 87%, you've got within that repeating pattern area, if you think about a checkerboard, okay? This is one of the squares in the checkerboard that goes across the whole field in between all the sprinklers, right? So we got that? So remember that thought. Next, this is a field. This is just an agricultural field out west of Fresno that we've mapped. And this happens to be variability in salinity. Salinity affects plant growth, how much water needs to be there, all kinds of stuff. But it could be just as easy a variation of soil salinity out here, as well as topography, hills and valleys and stuff, okay? And another thing, what I'd notice, here's very little bit of salts in the soil, here's a lot of salts. Notice again, these are real close together in this part of the field. So you're trying to manage averages in that field, right? With averages within your sprinkler pattern. And I'll give you one more horror story here to look at. And this is some work done by Blaine Hansen, who's a UC irrigation specialist. And what I'm showing here is that well, actually right here, the crop, the changes in the crop demand through the growing season, this is the growing season, varies wildly during the early amounts of the year, mid, and later. I mean, different crops will have different graphs. And the only point about this is that it varies widely, okay? So this is the crop water demand as it moves through the year. So take in your irrigation uniformity, your variability in the field, and the crop demand. You're trying to manage this target. You know, I mean, obviously, if you were managing it, you'd be, you know, you'd sort of normalize that curve, right? You kind of smooth it out. But you know, you're bouncing around. And so all I'm trying to share with you is a challenge to stay on top of the ball, okay? If you're the seal kind of trying to stay there, whatever. So let's talk about basin efficiency. I'm going to give you a real simple analysis of this. And really what I want to share with you is I want to make sure we don't double count water. There's a tendency to think that water saved in an irrigation event is somehow freed up and shows up in the delta. And I'll show you some data that suggests that's probably not the case. So in this case, we got a farmer, he's got 3 units of water, whatever that is, 3 gallons, 3 acre feet, whatever. But he's only 33% efficient, okay? And so his crop only uses 1. The other 2 actually go down in deep perk, below down into the aquifer. That water gets pumped up to farm B, and he's 50% efficient. He's better than his buddy, but he still puts 1 down below, and then the last farmer, he uses it all, which isn't really possible, but in this example. And include this example, I want to make sure I don't mislead you that we do need to use additional water beyond what the crop uses for leaching, get salts out of the root zone, some other things. So there are some water that, you know, is lost in this equation. But I think the real thing I wanted to point out to you was that if you counted up 3, 2, and 1, you got 6 units. But only 3 got used by the crop. So if you thought that, gee, if I was like this guy, only used 1, I could save 1 there and 2 there, then I got 3 units to sell, to reuse. They don't exist because we're being reused. Okay, conjunctive use kind of stuff, where we're pumping it out of the ground, even though it may have been surface water in the beginning. So just to kind of give you a sense of that. I'm going to show you some examples. Hopefully it'll be a little more explicit when I go through the examples here. So Thomas Harder, who's a UC Davis guy. Maybe he's been here to speak, I don't know. Turns out I was at a conference he was talking at, and him and I actually were on the same card. And he had a few slides here that I really want to share with you because I thought it really did drive the point of how one district's inefficiency becomes the source of the next district's water. So what we're going to look at here is Lower Tule River ID. Oops, let me back up one here. I lost a slide there. I don't know what happened to it. Anyway, and Pixley Irrigation District. And this irrigation district, Tule and Delano, both have significant surface water rights, actually from some of the local streams, but also from the San Joaquin River via the Friant Water. This is down in Tulare County, and I thought I had a slide that showed Tulare County, but apparently it went away. And Pixley Irrigation District does not have surface water rights, okay? They have to pump from the ground. And here you can see the canals, the very extensive canals up here in the lower Tule. You get in the Pixley Irrigation District, almost no surface water delivery because they don't have much surface water rights, so why build the canal, right? And to get water into the ground, both rivers and canals are a good way to do that. They are a conduit to the groundwater and a good way to get fresh, clean water down there. And what I wanted to show you here, and what Thomas Harder and his colleagues have done, is they've modeled for 30 years the water supply and water demand of these water districts. And what you can see here is that the blue kind of follows along the hydrologic cycle, where between droughts and, if you remember, 77, 76 were real dry years in our area. Look at that, almost no water coming in the blue lines, okay? And so we were dependent on imported water, and collectively those 2 lines are the water supply for the water districts we're going to be looking at. And just again, just to kind of give you a sense of how all this works, we apply water and you get rainfall on top. What doesn't get used by the crop in the root zone works its way through the vadose zone and then down into the aquifer for reuse, okay? And what I wanted to show you here again, we've got the lower Tule up here, and we've got Pixley ID right here. And just notice that the cropping patterns are very similar, okay? Don't need to go through all that, but you got orchards and you've got alfalfa and vegetables. And if you just kind of look at the color schemes, pretty similar, okay? So there's not much difference as you were to drive between those 2 water districts. You probably wouldn't know you were crossing into a different water district just based on the cropping patterns, okay? In in these different years, we're looking at, we've got water supply by precipitation, surface water, and groundwater. And again, what you can look at is right here in 76, 77. What do we got? We got the dark purple or the sort of medium purple, and what is that? Groundwater. So we're having to use a lot of groundwater to make up in those years that we have drought. And again, you can see it over here. So I mean, no mystery. When the surface water is not available, we're going to irrigate our crops. And when you get into permanent crops, it's not like you can just fallow for a year. You know, these things are in for 20 years. You've gone to your banker, you've sworn to them, you've got a water supply, you're set up to manage those crops, and so you've got to find your water, and so groundwater is a real good way to get at it. And then down here on where the water goes, okay, we've got crop ET, which is the biggest user of water. This aerial recharge is really on-farm deep percolation, which is the yellow stuff. So you can see, again, in the drought years, look how little water went into the aquifer, okay? And same thing right here. Those farmers were managing their water very, very closely when they were pumping it, right? Because it's expensive. So price does have a cost. And what I want to show you here simply is that there's recharge in all these canals when they're running, and that's one source of recharge. And then the other source of recharge, again, this is a model that was done by Tom Harder et al. The recharge is occurring here, and the recharge is occurring here because that's the surface water supplies. And right here, there's not much recharge, and that's because that's all essentially all pumped water. And if you look over here, you can see that the higher pumping water, again, is right on the irrigation boundaries. You cross the boundary into the great land of surface water, and not much pumping going on, okay? I mean, it's pretty rational. I mean, this just really follows. And this is the take-home message as we're getting closer. What we've got Pixley Irrigation District, okay? These are unintended groundwater exchanges. And really what this shows, this is the water supply for Pixley Irrigation District, and this is the source of that water. Lower Tule, we showed you just the irrigation district just to the north, supplies most of the water via a ground over-irrigation and conduit. That flow of water into the aquifer goes to Pixley Irrigation. So what's happened, there's 75,000 acre feet. What's happened over the last 50 years is these symbiotic relationships have occurred. People have, adjacent to these surface irrigated water districts that have water rights, pumped water out. That water level has been maintained at some level due to the over-irrigation of the adjacent district. So if we were to go into this water district, into Lower Tule and say, you know what, you're over-irrigating, we're going to take that water away and we're going to divert it somewhere because we can save it. Okay, we're going to put you all on drip or something and we're going to manage it close. Well, we just wiped out Pixley Irrigation District. They're gone. That whole region where all that ag is going on, it's over. So just understand, we can do that. There's no doubt about it. But sort of the law of unintended consequences, that this third-party impacts are real. They're there. You can see it's real constant over 30 years. And then, interesting enough, Pixley Irrigation District, the water that moves through underneath that district actually goes to help some of the unincorporated lands and a little bit of Alpaw Irrigation District, sort of downslope, if you will. So the water's being shared, but in this case, Pixley's getting after it. And they wouldn't exist if there wasn't inefficient irrigation in Lower Tule. Well, and some of that comes from the canals, unlined canals and stuff. And by the way, I could show you the same graph for the city of Fresno. The water supply for the city of Fresno is the east side of Fresno. And if the east side were to go to drip, Fresno would be in deep trouble. They would have to figure out how to get that water in there and treat it and stuff, because that water flows right in. So again, we've established these relationships over the last 50, 60 years. If we're starting today with a blank piece of paper, would we do it different? Absolutely. But this is the reality, and so we have to make very careful choices when we decide we're going to make changes in irrigation efficiencies and how that affects other folks and what that really means. So, okay, going along here, and you're going to give me the hook, right? How much more time do I get?
5 minutes.
5 minutes? Okay, I'm going to talk faster than I already am, which is probably way too fast. I think this is a big problem. I think populations is huge. I know the Sierra Club tried to talk about it a few years ago. They had a big split in their membership. You know, how dare you talk about, you know, these things. But it's real and it's not going away. So, you know, 2030, we're going to be, I don't know, close to 50 million. And the only good news is I probably won't be around in 2050, but there'll be 80 million folks in California. And I don't think the environment's got a chance. You know, when somebody's standing on every square foot of the state, game over. I don't care what you think you're doing. It's game over because nothing's going to happen. So, okay, I got to move here. So what's going to happen as we go forward? Urban's going to need more water and ag's going to get less, right? Because we're going to be up to 80 million people. Water's going to come out of ag's 80% share of developed water supplies, coming out of the California Water Plan, and the impact of reducing irrigated farmland by 10% and reducing what we term irrecoverable losses. That's water that's not being recycled. Okay, then there's a little bit of water out there we think can still be got, but a lot of this water is being recycled. Again, if we take it away and shove that to a city, we just wiped out Pixley Irrigation District. Okay, so just know that that's what happens. Climate change, we hear a lot about that. And so with the Scripps Institute, says it's going to get a little warmer, 1-3 degrees. Again, 2050, I can dig that. I ain't going to worry about it. What happens then? We're going to have less snowpack, right? And so that means we have more rainfall. Right now, the storage for the state of California, if you understand a reservoir system, says, hey, you know, we load it up in snowfall, it melts over 4 months, and like Millerton Lake, which is close to me, in a normal year, if there ever was such a thing, it fills and discharges 3 times, right, in a course of a normal year. And that's all predicated on slow snow melt over May, June, July, maybe a little of August. If it all comes down as a rainfall, it goes over the top of the dam, next stop, San Francisco Bay. And so our current system may not yield as much water under this scenario, let alone if we do some other things to try to make it better. And so if we lose 30 to 70% of our natural storage, which is our snowpack, as we said, without trying to interrupt or store that along the way, it's gone. What I wanted to show you here just real briefly, all of these areas are well-drained soils that we can use for groundwater recharge. And if we don't quit building cities and parking lots over this stuff, we're going to lose that forever. And we really need to figure out how to get water there and recharge it in the aquifer. And we got to do it more than just in storm events. We can say, gee, you know what, this year was wet. For 3 months, we can put water out there, we can recharge, and we go another 4 years without recharging it. I don't think that's the best way to utilize this kind of stuff. If we can store water in the Sierras and slowly apply it for 12 months a year, year after year into the recharge basin, we'll totally utilize those at its maximum, get as much water in the ground as we can. And so that's why it's important. And this is a slide kind of to scare everybody. If the Sierras, here's snow now, and here's what we got. So if you're a skier, the world looks bad. Drought has big impacts. If we have less dependable water supplies, this is just the current stuff, almost $1 billion. Not good. Planning for the future. We are taking a lead down in Fresno, trying to get an integrated regional water management plan for the San Joaquin Valley, which I got to tell you includes San Joaquin County and Kern County, and those are really 2 bookends. They have some, should I say, different views on peripheral canal and other things. And it just depends where you live and where you get your water. I understand that. And there's a lot of planning going on. And I would tell you that ag has been pretty progressive. I've got some numbers that indicate $1.5 billion has been spent on-farm water conservation in the last 5 years. Okay, so they are doing a lot of stuff. That's quite a bit of funds to get stuff moving on. But really, we got to plan for this. We cannot let courts and other things, I think, determine our water policy. We've got to get in front of the curve, be rational, and hopefully make good decisions. What I want to show you here, this is the region that we're trying to put a regional plan in together. It's 8 counties, and we got most of it covered. And I got to tell you, the guys have been really good. Or the gals, whoever we're working with. These areas where they're polka dotted, we're not covered in water districts and stuff. We went to them and said, look, for planning purposes, would you include areas outside your water district? Because there's nobody there that's going to take the lead. And they've been very, very helpful in joining that effort to say, okay, for planning purposes, we'll include places outside our water district to really provide water into the future. And so we're real happy about that. So anyway, the complexity of that, one IRWIMP, what we call our Integrated Regional Water Management Plan that we're working on down in Kern, has 46 agencies, okay? My God, I mean, like getting this whole room together and say, okay, do we know what day it is? Can we agree on what time it is? And kind of go from there. So it is going to be a challenge, okay? As you saw, almost the valley floor is almost completely covered. I just would throw this out here to show you the differences in depth to groundwater. And guess what? Under major cities up and down the valley, it's a little bit further down because these cities are just built on pumping water, okay? So we got to fix that. And then down in Bakersfield, I don't know. We got to hope for a miracle. Okay, summary and conclusions, if I can have another minute or two. Thank you. What I was trying to show you is that on-farm irrigation efficiency, whether I'm 30, 60, 100, or 100% efficient, is not the same as basin efficiency. You saw down at Pixley Irrigation in Tulare, Lower Tule, that one person's over-irrigation or the infiltration of canals or rivers there becomes the source water for the next. And again, like I said, City of Fresno, City of Visalia, up and down the state, that's where we're at on that. This is the reality. Is it a perfect system? Heck no. Because here you go. Energy and water quality are issues, okay? And I can tell you, I had some conversations with the City of Fresno 20 years ago. We had some pretty nasty water quality issues. They spent $200 million on wellhead protection, granulated activated carbon to clean up the water, City of Sanger as well. And I said, gee, you know, that's a lot of money. Couldn't we just like put all the farmers on the east side on drip and pay their power bill and then take that canal water and find some places for recharge or treat it, you know? But so I'm at this forum like this, you know, there's a bunch of people and they're doing the city's plan, and the city manager says, that's outside our study area, so we can't really consider it. You know, and yet on their map, they'll show that that's the water source for the city of Fresno for the next 50 years. So you can't have this, so it's a huge disconnect. I would say today, if we had that same conversation, I think it would be much, much different. But 10, 12 years ago, or 15, it just, you know, wasn't on the radar screen, man. We're gonna just, you know, engineer that thing to death, and we got $200 million, by God, we're gonna spend it. Okay, so currently ag uses more water than is available, long-term sustainability. I showed you the NASA stuff, several hundred million acre feet a year are coming out of the water, of the aquifer. Future planning, you cannot talk about groundwater storage without, I believe, this is my opinion, surface storage and conveyance, because if you're only going to put water there in flood events, if it's only 1 in every 4 years, you just don't have enough residence time and capacity to get that water there. It's just going to overflow and go to the bay. So we really need to hold it up in the Sierras or wherever else we can, and then slowly feed it to those recharge basins such that that water 12 months a year, year after year, is being recharged in the basin and being extracted in other areas. And we got to base it on good science. Okay, it's got to be documented. We can't do knee-jerk stuff. We got it, and we got to include all 3 of these players, okay? Because if they aren't there, they're going to be mad and they're going to stop you. And we know that they do, and it just depends on whose ox is being gored on which day. So they all understand the court system and they'll complain about it, but they'll be the next ones to use it if they think it's to their advantage. So let's get some good science out there. Let's look for long-term sustainability, and I think we have a chance. But without that, I'm not very optimistic that we're going to have any sort of water future in the state. So with that, I guess we're going to save at the end, or do you want to do them now?
Later, at the end.
Okay. Then I'm going to sit down and listen to our next speaker.
Next speaker is Juliet Christian Smith. Juliet got her PhD here in Berkeley from Aspen, spent a year on a Fulbright in Portugal studying the European Water Framework Directive, and is now a senior research associate working on water issues at the Pacific Institute.
Thanks very much. Good evening, and thank you for the opportunity to present here at the California Water Colloquium. I'm a big fan of the series and of the Water Resource Center archives, which is so important and valuable to many of us in the water field. So thank you for that. I am now a senior research associate at the Pacific Institute, and if you're not familiar with us, we're an independent nonprofit based in Oakland. We conduct interdisciplinary research, and we partner with stakeholders to look at issues of environmental protection, economic development, and social equity. And we work in California, but also nationally and internationally. So today, I'm here to talk about irrigated agriculture and the future that we're facing. And I think that we've already had a nice summary of many of the challenging issues that face us, which we also covered in a recent report that I think many of you have already read, hopefully. We're really at a critical juncture in California and in the West in general in terms of water. It's the 21st century, and in many ways we're still managing our water as if we are living 100 years ago. And as growing pressures come to bear, including population growth, drought, and climate change, we really have two choices. And that is either to find more water or to do more with the water that we have. We believe it's possible to do both, but in some places it's increasingly difficult to do the first, that is, find more water, and thus increasingly critical that we do the second, which is do more with the water we have. So thinking about the first option, finding more water. Well, we all know, we're familiar with the traditional approach to water management in our state and in many areas, which is to build dams, aqueducts, or to tap groundwater. In some parts of the world, we may need to do more of this still, but in California, the options are few and far between. We have built on the majority of our good dam sites and even some not so good sites, and we already exploit the Central Valley groundwater aquifer to the tune of about 2 million acre feet a year. We have had serious impacts on the ecosystems and rivers of streams that feed the Sacramento-San Joaquin Bay Delta and the fisheries of the Delta itself. So it's certainly possible that we could squeeze in a few more dams, maybe one on the San Joaquin, maybe flood another valley in the off the Sacramento River north of the Delta. But the political and economic costs of this are very, very high, particularly at the moment. And we'll likely be faced with some of the same challenges that we face today. We're probably not going to build desalination plants for agricultural water use, considering the high costs. And we're probably not going to build pipelines from Canada or the Great Lakes, which is a great comfort to them, having been in Canada recently. I don't know if we're going to build a peripheral canal. But if we do, its primary purpose probably will not be to boost agricultural deliveries. It's likely that it's for the reliability of urban water supply and to help restore the ecology of the Delta. So fortunately, there are additional new supply options, but they're going to require different thinking. In particular, different operating rules for existing infrastructure, smart conjunctive use of groundwater and surface water, and innovative water trading. But I'm not really going to get into that today because I want to focus on the second issue that I brought up, which is doing more with the water we have. And I'm talking about improving the efficiency of water use so we can grow the food we grow now with less water. And we've already done this. We are making great strides in improving efficiency, but there's much more yet to be done. So this report that we released recently is about the potential to improve water use efficiency in California and how, importantly, to reduce the barriers to improving those efficiencies. And I'm going to focus on this for the moment, but I'll come back and speak to some of the responses to our report as well, and particularly this difference between on-farm and basin savings. In this report, we started with the fundamental assumption that a strong and healthy agricultural community and economy is important to California. If anybody disagrees, you can talk to the farmer or irrigation expert near you and they'll set you straight. When we then made the assumption that we want to grow as much food or more food as we currently grow, and that in the future, California will continue to play an important role in national and international markets for food. We made the third assumption that there are a wide range of policy choices. There are strategies for improving the efficiency of water use, and that they're not fully tapped. And this wasn't an assumption as much as it was an assessment of the reality on the ground. So therefore, there were two remaining questions. How much potential is there really, and how do we capture it? So the answer to the first question is really unknown and fairly unknowable because we don't have a crystal ball as much as we would like, and it's it will change drastically the potential conservation out there. The potential savings from conservation will change based on water prices, commodity prices, new infrastructure, water policy discussions. But it is completely within our ability to think about the second, which is how do we capture this, and to think about scenarios for what possible futures are. So scenarios are not predictions or forecasts, they are stories. I want to make that very clear. They are possibilities that we all explore when we think about the future. And every one of us does this what ifing every day. What if I buy this piece of equipment rather than another? What if Washington, D.C. decides that ethanol is not a great policy? What if Massachusetts didn't elect Scott Brown? We're constantly coming up with what ifs. So, that's kind of the style of scenario that we looked at. And we looked at 3 different options, none of which are new or radical, and rather all are based on precisely the kinds of things farmers around the state and around the West are already doing. So not to spoil the surprise, but I want to tell you what the conclusions are in case I lose you somewhere along the line. We found that there is great potential for improving efficiency, that many farmers are already doing it, that there are significant obstacles for capturing efficiency improvements, and that they can be overcome, but really the question that lies before us is, will they? So talking about where these potential savings will come from. So these are the 3 what-if scenarios that we analyzed. First, what if the trend toward improved irrigation technology continues? So this is specifically shifting from flood to sprinklers or from sprinklers to drip on appropriate crops. We've made a lot of progress in California in this area. 30 years ago, almost no orchards and vineyards were drip irrigated, and now 60 to 70% of them are. And drip is even being tried on some field crops. Of course, so we evaluated relatively modest additional shifts towards more efficient irrigation practices. Of course, technology alone cannot reduce water use. It's also inherent that you must manage it well. A drip irrigation system with 50% distribution uniformity is going to use a lot more water than a flood system with a very high distribution uniformity. So we looked at improved irrigation scheduling. So second what if. What if techniques to water according to a crop's needs were used rather than scheduling based on an arbitrary calendar? So we know that using local climate and soil data to schedule irrigation can be effective at reducing applied water use. Third what if regulated deficit irrigation is applied more comprehensively to appropriate crops? RDI is a technique that applies water stress to particular crops during drought-tolerant growth stages. And it's used by farmers in the state already. And there's a lot of studies through cooperative extension that tell us about its success on particular crops. So we only applied it in our model to those crops where we had a lot of data in California that said that it was successful at particular levels. So we then used the same model, it's an analytical model that was used by the Department of Water Resources in their last water plan update to model the applied water savings associated with these different scenarios. And I want to emphasize here that these are applied water savings. That means they include both consumptive and non-consumptive uses. And we've always been completely clear about that. And I will talk a little bit more about that in a moment, about why we didn't separate them out. Our conclusions were that first, combined savings of the 3 scenarios ranged from about 4.5 million acre feet in a wet year, to almost 6 million acre feet in a dry year. The savings were highest in dry years, and that might be kind of counterintuitive, but we get less rain, so we must apply more water, and demand is higher, and therefore there's more potential savings in dry years. And conservation and efficiency is therefore an important measure in terms of reducing vulnerability to drought and dry periods. So these results were hardly radical, given the experience of farmers on the ground and other studies of water use efficiency in the agricultural sector. The CalFed Bay Delta Record of Decision, the final report on water use efficiency evaluation, had some extremely long name, but you can find it online there, estimated that about 6.3 million acre feet are available statewide at the technical potential level. In addition, just looking at one hydrologic area, the Colorado River region, through their quantification settlement agreement, they're looking at 150,000 to 270,000 acre feet in savings from conservation annually. And there were some profiles of individual irrigators and irrigation districts that are implementing these measures on the ground. And we're actually following this up. In about a month, we'll be releasing a new report on agricultural water use success stories that profiles 7 different irrigation districts, farmers, the Yolo County bypass that does floods and farming, to show many of the ways that we're already seeing these innovations happen on the ground and how they can be duplicated in other areas. So there is this potential out there, yet there are also significant and important challenges to capturing savings. We have a whole list of them in the report, and you're more than welcome to look through them, but here I just wanted to focus on a few, particularly data. The lack of actual measurement and monitoring of our water use is a huge barrier for us to even understand what's going on. Economic and financial barriers are even more a problem now than in the past. Some of these measures require significant initial investment, even if over the life of the practice they might recoup costs and reduce energy and water. They still require this upfront investment. And confusing subsidies don't necessarily charge the full cost of water. Inflexible infrastructure includes the fact that in California, irrigation water is predominantly delivered through canals designed and constructed in the early 20th century. Nearly 80% of these systems are not able to provide water on demand to farmers, and that means when the farmer needs it. And this is a necessary precondition for a lot of these other efficiency strategies. So, for example, a rotational system will deliver water to a farmer on a rotational basis, potentially every 7 days or 14 days, whether the farmer needs it on day 2 or on day 20. In addition, the irrigator may receive the entire water flow and may not be able to give back excess water if they don't need some portion of that water. Beyond these clear challenges, we also have a significant, in my opinion, actually, the largest challenge is old thinking. And 3 prevalent myths that have also been common responses to our work have been, first, that we've done all we can do, that there's no more savings available out there. The second is that only consumptive water savings matter. And the third is that we accurately understand what's going on with our water use and flows in California. And in the next several slides, I want to just explain why I believe that these are inaccurate and unhelpful in kind of confronting the major challenges we have in front of us in terms of agricultural water. The first case, it's clear that not only irrigation technology, but also management can be improved. We don't know exactly who is doing what. There's been no recent or widespread studies on the use of, for instance, irrigation scheduling and regulated deficit irrigation. So I can't give you numbers on that. I would love to. But I can give you numbers on the kinds of irrigation practices people are using in the state. And you might be surprised to know that in California, still 60% of our irrigated acreage is flood irrigated. And there are high unproductive evaporative losses through flood irrigation. Even in even in orchards and vineyards where there's been a lot of data showing yield improvements, quality improvements, revenue improvements with drip irrigation or micro sprinklers, there's still about 20 to 25% that are in flood. The second is that only consumptive water savings matter. So the response is that non-consumptive savings are critical. So only consumptive water savings matter. This means that only reductions in water that's consumed either through evaporation, transpiration, losses to saline sinks are important. And obviously reducing consumptive uses is very valuable. This water can be sold, traded, reallocated to other purposes. And some of the savings that we identified are actually consumptive, like RDI, but not all of it. There is a new realization, and it's not fully appreciated, that saving non-consumptive uses also has a high value. Every acre foot of water that is applied that does not need to be applied requires taking it out of a stream or out of a groundwater basin. And this costs farmers energy and money. It often costs the state energy and money, and it hurts in-stream ecosystems and reduces water quality. Related to this criticism is the argument that if so much water could be saved, where is it? It must be going somewhere. And it is. Some of it is being consumed in unproductive evaporation. Some of it's disappearing in the production of low-valued crops. Some of it's ending up in other vegetation like weeds, and some of it's flowing off of fields as contaminated return flows, and some of it is ending up in saline groundwater. Some of the most productive agricultural regions of our state are actually dealing with this issue of a saline shallow aquifer close to the surface. And here, this map is the Department of Water Resources. Present problem areas are in red, and the orange and yellow are future potential problem areas. These are areas where you have a water table that's 0 to 5 feet below the surface in the present problem areas, and 5 to 20 feet in the potential problem areas. So these groundwater tables are actually pushing salts and contaminants back up into the crop root zones. Over-irrigation, this brings up another point about water quality. Over-irrigation mobilizes contaminants such as nitrates, phosphates, pesticides, and salts into groundwater bodies and surface water bodies. And this can create severe environmental and public health problems and can require extensive treatment, but through treatment plants in nearby communities. At the Pacific Institute, we're currently doing a project with the Community Water Center that's located in Visalia. And what we're looking at is estimating the health effects of contaminated groundwater on primarily farm worker communities that live there and who are reliant on these groundwater wells for their drinking water. Other issues, avoiding infrastructure costs. Building new infrastructure can be very time-consuming, costly, and politically controversial. Energy. There's potential energy savings in terms of capturing, conveying this water to farmers. Often requires significant energy inputs, and reducing water withdrawals can therefore save energy and associated greenhouse gas emissions. And finally, ecosystem restoration. I had to touch on this because I've been at many conferences lately where I hear a lot about the Delta smelt. When we're talking about the law of unintended consequences, I think this is really important to include. Unintended consequences are happening, and they're happening in many different places. It's not just about the Delta smelt. The NOAA NIMS biological opinion that was produced last year actually saw that the Central Valley Project and State Water Project operations are endangering many species, including endangered chinook, winter run, spring run, threatened steelhead, threatened green sturgeon, and now also southern resident killer whales. There's also socioeconomic impacts related to this devastation. The closure of commercial fisheries the last 2 years, and the jobs that are lost through that as well. Finally, the last myth was that we understand the fate of non-consumptive water use. So perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these myths is that they're based on a central fallacy, which is that we actually understand water balances statewide. And unfortunately, and I do think this is a really unfortunate thing, this couldn't be farther from the truth. We actually do not directly measure agricultural water use as a state. We use estimates based on irrigated crop acreage, which is several years old. Reference evapotranspiration rates for those crops. And then we assume that we understand how much water is being applied. We don't directly measure groundwater use in most places. We don't directly measure evaporative loss, and we do not measure groundwater recharge and return flows in most cases. So the Tom Harder study that we were presented with is great, and it would be wonderful if we could have that in basins throughout the state. But we don't at the moment, and we need to better manage this haphazard system of groundwater recharge and extraction. In addition, there's no way we can have accurate water budgets at the state scale at this point in time. Unfortunately, the future will bring new challenges, and key among them is the impact of climate change on water availability, as was already pointed out. And I'm gonna skip over a couple of slides because they're the same. But this is an average runoff for 2050, showing decreases in the reds and oranges. And you can see in the western United States, their projections show that we'll have less runoff. This will be driven in part by the decreasing snowpack, which was also brought up before. And the future of California agriculture will be characterized by greater competition over water, because we'll have less overall runoff. Supply will be increasingly out of phase with demand because of this earlier snowmelt due to warming temperatures. And water demand will be rising due to hotter temperatures and higher evapotranspiration rates. So this isn't getting better, unfortunately. In order to respond to these new and persistent challenges, I believe we really need new thinking. Switching from seeing inefficient irrigation or over-irrigation as a kind of haphazard system that works, we know what the consequences are. We're dealing with them right now. Poor water quality, drainage problems, ecosystem destruction, this constant need for new infrastructure and ongoing competition for water. We know that scenario. New thinking will require us to really be much more focused on understanding where our water is going and smart and efficient about how we use it. This can lead to, obviously, reduced drainage problems, which is a big issue for a lot of farmers, higher productivity per unit of water, enhanced in-stream flows, and a focus on more flexible infrastructure. So instead of just conveying large amounts of water to through canals, also getting it from the canals to the farm and delivered on demand to the farmer so they have more options in the future. And there are tangible steps that we can take in order to get there. They include actually monitoring water use, financial incentives to help offset that initial investment, enforcement of our constitutional mandate of reasonable and beneficial use, strategic conjunctive use of surface and groundwater resources, including agriculture and statewide conservation targets, and increased educational and technical assistance, the on-the-ground work that's done by so many people in the different university systems and NRCS and RCDs. So in the future, I hope that the debate can be about how to best achieve water savings. I fear that the alternative is that we continue to deal with agricultural water challenges in a haphazard, incoherent, fragmented way, and that we let Sacramento's unofficial water policy be that we hope next year is a wet one. I don't believe that this is the best thing to do, and I don't believe that many people in the agricultural community think so either, considering the remarkable transition that's already occurring on the ground. This is really a great time to be in water policy, strangely enough. We face serious risks, but I also believe that there are real, effective, and affordable solutions that can take us from where we are now, dealing with this system, to where we want to be in order to deal with the future challenges that are coming at us. I do believe this transition is inevitable, but the challenge we face is to change our thinking in order to make sure we're changing fast enough to avoid painful and disruptive impacts that we all hope to avoid. Thank you.
Okay, now for the questions. Can you please wait for the mic to ask your question so we can get the question on the tape? That's great.
Thanks. You mentioned that some farmers had adopted RDI or DRIP or that sort of thing. Some haven't. Have you looked into why those farmers that have not done that have not?
Well, do I have to let this on or not? So the thing is, we actually don't know who the farmers are who have it or don't have it. I mean, I know anecdotally from work I did with Cooperative Extension in one area of the state, but we don't have statewide information about the practices that farmers are using on the ground. And I think this is a huge gap in terms of our ability to effectively address that issue.
I would say that and she didn't show processing tomatoes, but processing tomatoes in the state are pretty much grown on drip irrigation now, and RDI is practiced on almost every single field. The reason being is that the canneries wouldn't take it if they didn't dry the tomatoes down before they came in for processing, because all that water has to be cooked off with energy. So they simply turn the irrigation off 10 or 14 days ahead of harvest. Now timing gets real important. You get screwed up, right, if you don't get harvest. But so there is some risk to that. But there is quite a bit. The grape industry, the wine grape industry practices quite a bit of that that I'm aware of. But I can tell you there's a lot of dangers. I was over in Australia about 10 years ago, and at the time there was the new savior for grapes was something called PRD, partial root zone drying, and farmers had invested literally hundreds of thousands of dollars over there, and essentially it was 2 lines and you irrigated the other side of the vine. Anyway, we came back, said that was interesting, we did some research and it was all a hoax, and it's another story, but there is a real problem with some of these small pieces of data trying to apply it across the whole state, because a lot of them turn out not to be true. And PRD is a good one, and we actually have a paper published on that if you want to see what that was all about. But that was something that was adopted widely by the industry down in Australia, turned out to not be what they thought it was. But I agree that there's a big lack of data, and that's the big, and so I think 80% of what we do, we agree with what's being presented here. I think the 20% is that you can't get those kinds of projections and numbers without the data, and we think the data doesn't exist. We think they're way high on some of their projections, so just so we're on the same page.
I have a follow-up question. Do you think RDI is not? Do you think it's like PRD, not going to be useful?
Well, what I'm saying is it's been almost 100% adopted in canning tomatoes. So when it's crop appropriate, if we can get people to pay a little more for a bottle of wine, then RDI makes some sense, because it, in theory, makes a better grape that makes a better wine. So there has to be a value chain associated with that. Otherwise, the farmer's getting paid on production. So instead of having 10 tons an acre of grapes, I might have 6. So I've got to have the equivalent cash flow for using less water. And so you have to understand the background of why this is being done. It's not to have the same crop with less water. Just make sure that you don't have that misconception, because that is not what's going on here. We believe we can grow a better grape, particularly in the Central Valley, with less water if we manage the stages of growth from bloom to veraison, and we've done quite a bit of that. So it's more than just the farmers doing it. If they don't get the economic return, if they still get $120 a ton for those grapes and they get 6 tons instead of 10, they're not going to do it, because the water is cheaper for those 4 tons than the return. And so it's much more complex than is being suggested here. The wineries have to pay more for those, and then you, the consumer, have to get away from $2 chuck and go to $4 chuck, and then we can save some water. And that's the reality of what we're talking about here.
Question for both of you, two-part. One, can you talk about how there is been this change in cropping patterns over the last decade? I think, David, you talked about alfalfa and silage crops really increasing in some areas.
No, I don't think I said that, but okay, go ahead.
Well, the dairy's moving in.
What's that? The dairies, yeah, sure. Exactly.
I think there's this conception, part of the problem is there's these high water, low value crops, like cotton is often used, but cotton has really decreased in the Central Valley.
It's not king anymore.
But alfalfa has increased. And then how much conversion to perennial crops, to the tree crops, has there been? What percentage of the land has been converted, or is it mainly new land, or is it conversion from existing crops to tree crops?
Well, one of the problems we're having, particularly on the west side, is that went from row crops to permanent crops. And permanent crops have a life of 15 or 20 years. And when you get an interruption of water supply, okay, now that year's crop and everything futures in So I don't know percentages, but I know we're over $1 billion of almonds being produced in this state. And we are 99% of the production of the country in almonds. And there is 1 million acres roughly of grapes. But that includes I think there's 600,000 of wine grapes, 300,000 of table grapes, and 100,000 of raisin grapes, roughly. So 10% or more of the entire state is in grapes. And in my part of the world, it's probably 90%. There's some areas that's just grapes, grapes, and grapes. But there is, because you're chasing the dollar, right? There's a very interesting study done by a colleague of mine called Mickey Paggi. He's an ag economist as well at Fresno State. And he did a study on the value of water and for processing tomatoes. And he basically said, if you can't get $75 a ton for your processing tomatoes, you should grow a different crop, because the return, the options for other crops, and I can't tell you what those are, but so what that message went to the processors, they ended up paying $85 or $88. So for the first time, we're getting the value of water is driving, right, the price received back. And if we get that signal to start working, then a lot of these things will take care of themselves.
Well, that was my follow-up question.
Okay.
Is pricing, and I guess, Juliet, how much did you look into, the role of pricing and pretty much,
Yeah.
getting
Well,
into that issue?
Yeah, so I first wanted to answer your question from this. We actually brought the report. Heather brought it. Heather Cooley is my fellow senior research associate. So in 1980, more than 5.6 million acres of land in the Central Valley were planted in field crops, and by 2002 that dropped by 1.7 million acres, and this was offset by a rise in orchard, vineyard, and vegetable acreage. So that's kind of the...
Right, and this cotton, I think a lot of people do think that cotton is still a major, it's
Right.
still locally significant, but it's really, really...
It's probably a tenth of what it was back in the 80s.
Yeah. In terms of the pricing, I think I completely agree that that's a big driver. I've worked on vineyards land, and depending on who they're contracting for, if it's Fetzer or higher end wine or Constellation Vineyards, they're using different practices. So that is definitely part of the equation.
What about the whole problem of gaming water rights and things like that, that the economics is supposed to make sense, and when you're talking water, it doesn't seem to, and you get better results when water flows uphill to money than your pricing signals. Why do people plant almonds on junior interruptible water supplies?
That's a good question.
Well, farmers are risk takers. Some take more risks than others, I suppose. And I think there's always this fallacy to put all farmers in the same bag, just like I wouldn't put all of you in the same bag or bucket. There's a diverse group there. Some of them will tell you that they're the original environmentalist. I know I have friends of mine that have deer herds that live in their orchards and other things, and they make a lot of habitat going on. So that's at risk. You pencil it out, and you're looking back. You say it's been a pretty dependable water supply, and some black swan event occurs, if you will, a judge's decision, if you want to call it that, and it ends. The water supply ends.
I think in terms of the pricing issue, there's a couple of different confounding factors. The first are the subsidies that are provided through federal and state projects, the Central Valley Project in particular, that kind of skew water rates since they haven't been repaid for their initial capital costs, never mind operation and maintenance costs. And on top of that, the thing I was saying about infrastructure, on the district-wide infrastructure, if it's not able to accurately monitor even the volumetric amount of water that's going to a particular turnout, it's very difficult to charge accurately for water, and even to institute a tiered rate structure, or a rate structure that will actually incentivize efficiency by charging more per unit of water used. So we see that happening a lot in urban agencies now, where they are doing steep tiers. If you get your water from East Bay Mud, you might know that. But at the irrigation district level, it's still fairly uncommon, and the recent legislation actually only requires that irrigation districts charge by volume, not that they institute any kind of conservation rate pricing.
But to your question on, and I think that's to one of the points that we're seeing in ag, and it's a disruption of a water supply in any given year, particularly on permanent crops. And what I would hope in a perfect world is that the state would commit to saying we're going to irrigate and pick a number, 5 million acres, 6, and that because of national security, because we like to eat, whatever, we want to have that as a long term, and that those water supplies then would be quote unquote available every year at a certain level. And then the stuff beyond that, the fringe stuff, it's going to be in urban development, some will be reclaimed back to environmental stuff. I mean, I just heard something last week that I don't know that I really liked, but I heard of a grower that bought out a duck club for the water rights. So now here's an area that had been flooded historically for years for wildlife. now has not got no water on it. Doesn't work very good for ducks. Maybe something else will move in there. So, I mean, we're seeing, you're talking about exchanges and water sales and stuff. Understand, it's not just farmer to farmer and stuff. I mean, or farmers to urban. You got people buying environmental water rights and shoving it in a farm. So things are moving around, and who knows how it's going to end up. But I think without a plan, I think we both agree that without a plan, the outcome's probably not going to be good.
Yeah, hello. I just had a small question, maybe, if you had any updates on like the future rice production and flooding. I know Northern California produces over 600,000 hectares of rice. That's all flooded, so just kind of want to hear your perspective on that.
Well, I'll just share with you. I mean, you've read Cadillac Desert, right? And I hope, if you haven't, you should. That's just a great novel. But, you know, one of the, I think, awakenings of that was that you get these multiple uses. You get flooding of rice fields, if you will, and you get the migratory wildfowl moving through. And so instead of burning rice like they used to, and they can flood out the weeds and stuff, hold the water a little longer. So anytime we can get double use out of the water and triple use, you know, I'm a big fan of that. So if we can grow rice and then have the migratory birds that move through use that area and that water, I think that's a good thing, because, you know, we've lost 90% of our wetlands, and that's a bad thing.
Yeah, in our report, we actually didn't change any of the irrigation for rice fields, given that drip has been experimentally tried, but not with enough success for us to feel that it was able to be put in there. And I just was visiting the Yolo County bypass, which is conjunctively managed for floods, wildlife, and farms, and they have rice production going on there. This, you know, the co-benefits that come from that situation, I think, are something we should be striving for, where the agricultural community and the environmental community and local interests are, you know, having a mutually beneficial relationship.
Yeah, and so I was going to, Mark Reisner was a big supporter of that, you know, and he saw that as an example of perhaps how ag and environment could work together. Because if you were to put that rice ground on drip, if you could, the ducks aren't going to like that. I guarantee it. You know, just not going to work for them. And then they get all crowded up, and you got cholera and all that other stuff that, you know, I mean, that they can get, or whatever, avian flu or whatever they get. Anyway.
I'd like to make a comment and then come with a question, because the issue you're talking about, that is what David was saying, was if you had higher irrigation efficiency, as Juliet recommends, there would be more groundwater overdraft, everything else being equal in many parts of the valley. And that's been you know, an issue in California water for at least 50 years. 22 years ago, I served as the economic staff of the State Water Board for the first 3 years of the Bay Delta hearings. And I want to tell you of an event that came up, because I think David's right. The water table would be lower if you had higher irrigation efficiency. I was recommending that as a staff member of the State Board. And as an economist, it seemed to me the thing to do was to use a groundwater model, which the state had paid for and was paying for, to measure how much lower would the groundwater table be each year, say for the next 30 years, if you had higher irrigation efficiency along the lines I proposed, and figure out the economic cost of having farmers throughout the Central Valley having to pump from a greater depth because the water table was lower because of the irrigation efficiency. So I actually measured the economic cost to farming of, I was proposing higher irrigation efficiency. It's a little like this report. And I had a meeting around this time, 22 years ago, in the spring of 1988, with a groundwater consultant, big guy, had built the model, was a consultant to the State Board. And I asked him if he could use the model and do that calculation. And he drew himself to his full height and said, that would be too political, I'm not going to do it. And to this day, that calculation has not been done. Neither Tom Harter nor anybody else has used models to do the calculation I'm suggesting, which is figure out how much more expensive, you know, year by year, looking 30 or 40 or however many years out. And I do think that would, it would help move this debate along. I mean, there will be a cost. I have no idea whether it's, you know, 5% or 50% or whatever. But it does show one thing, which is groundwater is the dirty secret of California agriculture and California water use. And the refusal to measure groundwater extraction by users permits it to continue as a secret, and is basically the obstacle, I think, to, as it were, reconciling your two different positions. And the question is, do you agree?
I will just take a stab at it, which is that I was just down at the Kern County Water Bank. And, you know, I think the issue is that we're both looking at different unintended consequences. There are unintended consequences of every action. And, you know, the collapse of the Bay Delta ecosystem is one. Increased pumping charges or having to drill farther into the groundwater table is another. And I agree that we do need a study that kind of quantifies that. But we also know that this is a really unmanaged system in terms of, you know, what's happening, monitoring use, keeping track of accounts of, you know, what's happening with the groundwater table. We only know because of this NASA study funded by USGS what's going on in the Central Valley. Really this idea of kind of more strategically getting to our goals. If our goal is to make sure that Pixley Irrigation District gets its groundwater, first we might want to conserve in Pixley Irrigation District, since they're sort of, it seems like, at the end of the basin. Secondly, we might want to actually purposely recharge areas with cleaner water than water that would come off of areas that potentially have selenium or salt problems. So this other issue of water quality is often not brought up in the debate at all. And at a very large scale, water is never lost. You know, if water evaporates, it's just going into water vapor. If it goes into the ocean, it's going to be recycled again. You know, at this mega scale, we're not losing water. We're just changing its quality and where it is. And that is very important in California, where the water is in terms of our environmental impacts and the quality that it is for our drinking water and agricultural use.
You know, you get into water law and stuff. I mean, you know, I know that you can pump water out off your property and use as much as you need beneficially. And there's this fear, and it's probably not an unfounded fear, that if I measure it and I report it, and the state needs revenue, they're going to say, you know, I think that maybe for every gallon we're going to charge you a nickel. And then next year maybe it's a dime, and you know, I think that's a rational fear. And I think that's a big problem why folks don't report it. They don't have to. They're feared about, as soon as you can measure it, you can tax it. And I think really that's the heart of this thing. So there needs to be some legislation, there needs to be some policy that somehow addresses that head on. Otherwise, I don't think you're going to hear much. Yeah. And I think that's the heart of this issue, is that it's just another revenue source. And now that we're going to be 20 billion short for the next 5 years, I suspect, you know, somebody's going to hear this on YouTube and say, there we go, we'll get some more. So that's my take on it. But I think, on the other hand, I think we're attacking this backwards. I think we need to look at from a water budget, what's our supply, and then accommodate demand to meet that, instead of trying to manage it from the bottom side. I just don't think that it's a very efficient way. I know there's this, you know, this idea that farmland's going to have to come out of production. We just got to say that, okay? It's just going to happen, okay? And you know, and if it isn't your ox getting gored, then it's okay. But that's the reality. You saw my slide, 10% reduced irrigated ag. So how do we get there? Because that's the only way we're going to manage supply, is to reduce demand. And on farms one way, but if I got 100 acres and I can farm 50 of that with twice the water I'd use on the whole 100 acres and have a better economic return, that's my choice. That's my risk. I don't want anybody to come in and say, you know, you need to grow this crop on this 100 acres and then use this much water. I would rather fallow half of that, perhaps, grow a much higher value crop, and let me, since it's my capital, let me assume the risk on that, because people flying in and telling me how to farm it, you know, then you should be assuming the risk if that's where you're going. So I'm much better by giving folks a water budget and let them decide, because farmers are pretty rational, as much as we think that they're, you know, perhaps they're not. They're very rational on farm. Those decisions are very much tied to their economic realities, including equipment and lots of other things, experiences.
I completely agree that farmers are rational, and they're usually, you know, working the system and they know what's going on. And the unfortunate part of it is that the system doesn't regulate groundwater or manage it or monitor it. And I think we've found a point of convergence here that we all agree upon. So now it's just trying to get some change, which is very difficult with groundwater.
I'll just mention a quick comment about the groundwater. You mentioned that it may be a fear of taxation, which keeps the impetus to measure it, but I'm not sure if that's the case. I feel like even if you dump the state board with every bit of data, there's still a fear that they do anything with it, they do the right thing. And I think that's also a concern why there isn't a push to measure.
Well, and I'm sure that everybody has a little different reason why they might not want to report those numbers, but clearly there's a lack of trust. Can we agree to that?
Yeah, there's also some issues with the State Water Resources Control Board in terms of the appointment process and the funding process, which makes it pretty closely tied to the governor and the budget, the political budgetary process. So, there's some structural reforms that have to happen in order to allow an agency like that to actually fulfill its mission.
Okay. Anybody? Does anyone have a question? Okay.
It's of course not the situation where we do measure groundwater, obviously, in adjudicated basins in urban areas, and of course where we have these big recharge projects, especially in the Kern County area, they're measuring what they're putting in and taking out because it's real dollars that they're getting for it. So we do.
Well, it's contracted too, and,
right.
And yeah, I mean it's all.
So when there's a will, there's a way. I mean.
And I would you brought up adjudicated, and what that means is that there's some authority that says you can extract so much water out of a particular well, and in Southern California, they've got there. But it's interesting to note how that happened. When that deal was cut, there was guarantees of surface supplies and everything, so everybody kind of was made whole, and then they agreed to being adjudicated. It wasn't just, okay, let's do it because it's the right thing. There was a lot of negotiation. So it was a package deal that everybody felt they were made whole down there, and that's how that deal got cut.
Yeah.
So my other question, though.
Can I say something about that too? Just being down at the Kern Water Bank and actually just talking about it with Michael, they actually don't have any control over the overlying landowners. They can pump out of the groundwater bank with no regulation and with no monitoring. So this is a huge issue for them in the future.
Right. Well, that's true. That one. This idea of reducing demand, we've talked several ways of doing. Change. There's the changing crops, which may or may not be. I think would be proposed as one way to do it. But there's also this idea of anti-transference that I've heard over the last 20 or 30 years, and some people think it's snake oil, and other people say it's the next greatest thing, and you hear that in China there's success with anti-transference. What's the latest in terms of the research, and both of you, I assume, have some knowledge there, and I'm wondering if you addressed that in your report.
I have no idea what anti-transference is.
Anti-transference.
Yeah, we've played with those, but let me tell you, I think there's other areas that are going to yield better. One of the things we've been doing in drip irrigation is we inject air through a little venturi, which is a non-mechanical way to do that. It's just a pressure drop, and put 10, 11% by volume, and we increase yields on farm fields. I mean, 100,000 acre fields on vegetables, 15% with the same water. Okay, so I think the focus needs to be on improving water use efficiency, and what I mean by that is taking a gallon of water, getting more produce. So we know that. We've taken CO2, and we've used the same drip systems to distribute CO2 gas in the canopies of market tomatoes. We've doubled the yield, okay? And also, we're sequestering CO2. So if we can get cheap sources of CO2, which you can find in some of the oil fields and stuff, and they're deep well injecting that, maybe we can use that, distribute it through our, so I think we need to, you want to talk about get out of the box, we need to get out of the box about how we're thinking about, because we get constrained about these things we've been thinking about for 20 years. But I can tell you that on market tomatoes, we doubled the yield on quarter acre. And for those who don't know, CO2 is a little heavier than air, so it tends to sink. In Europe, they do greenhouses are all pumped up with CO2 because that's what the plants like to breathe and give us back oxygen. But we would take it from 300 to 900 parts per million in the field. It stays in the field. It's called FACE, field applied CO2 enrichment or something. And we've done it on strawberries and other things. And so there are some opportunities as we look at this global warming thing to use agriculture as a place to improve yields, same amount of water, and I don't even know if I gave it another 10% water, could I get another doubling of the yield? I mean, so, when I talk to some groups, particularly environmental groups, talk about using more water per acre, they just freak out. And I'm saying, no, just settle down. Because if I can double my yield with 10% more water, that's a good deal for everybody. And we got to get past the hang up that it's got to be less water per acre. That may not be where we need to go. And I just want to plant that out there because I really, in my heart of hearts, believe that we may use more water per acre, but maybe we only have half as many acres to get more yield.
Okay, thank you so much. Great presentations. Thank you.